Hello, wonderful fifth graders. I know it has been a while, but we are back to finish The Wednesday Wars by Gary D. Schmidt today. This is all thanks to Scholastic Books for allowing me to continue reading this to you guys while we are doing digital school now. So we need to recap what happened when we last read before spring break. All right, so last we read Holling and his class and Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Sidman were on their camping trip and had started to pour rain. Now, once it stopped raining, everybody was soaking wet because they're not sleeping in tents, they're sleeping on the ground. And their sleeping bags were wet. And the mosquitoes came. And there were a lot of them. They described the mosquitoes as looking like a cloud of smoke following people. So that's a lot of bug bites. And we left off with Holling having some sort of revelation as he was watching the stream in the morning after not being able to sleep in his wet sleeping bag. So we are picking up right there where he was standing at the water thinking about the beauty of it all, and that he didn't tell anybody about what he had seen or what he was thinking about what he had seen. And we left off with him not telling anyone, not even Danny, who was hoping for a miracle, right up to the day of his bar mitzvah. All right. You could see him waiting for the worst to happen when he stood up in the synagogue a week later, a synagogue that was full. Mostly with Hupfers. Mrs. Baker and Mrs. Beguio and Mrs. Sidman sat near the front. My Thee and Merrill Lee and Heather and I sat behind a group of ancient Hupfers. I was trying to keep my borrowed yarmulke on the back of my head because it felt like it was slipping down all the time. And our parents were there too. Even my father, who I guess figured that Mr. Hupfer might someday need an architect, and so he better show up, just in case. It was sort of like an investment, he thought. He sat as far away from Mr. Kowalski as he could. We all watched as Danny pulled the prayer shawl his great-uncle had given him around his shoulders. The tassels reached below his waist. Then he wound the tefillin around his arms and across his forehead. You could see him still waiting for the worst, hoping for a miracle. Then the prayers, still waiting. Then he walked with the rabbi and cantor back to the altar and took out the Torah. We all stood. I reached up and pressed down my yarmulke, and he carried the Torah back to the reading desk. The rabbi drew it from his mantle, untied the scroll, and rolled it open. A huge breath from Danny, still waiting. And then, can you believe it? The miracle came after all. He lifted one of the tassels, touched it to the scroll, kissed it. He took the handles of the Torah in his own hands, and he began to sing. And everyone around us sang back. And Danny sang again, deep and steady, until he got to a part when everyone sang back just as deep and steady as he did, and then a collective Amen. Then Danny took a deep breath and began to read from the Torah. Okay, so maybe sometimes the real world is full of similes and miracles. Right there in front of us, Danny Hupfer was no longer Danny who stuck wads of gum under his desk, or Danny who screamed out of his skull at soccer games, or Danny who ran cross-country on bloody knees and waved sweaty t-shirts around in the air. He was more than all of those things. He sang the words, and he was everyone who had sung before him. Like he was taking up his place in this huge choir, and it wasn't Miss Violet of the very spiky heels, but God himself leading the music. You saw Danny covered with the weight. Then the cantor and Danny's father stood over him and blessed him. More weight. And Danny chanted again, this time from the prophets. More weight. And then Danny reached into his back pocket and took out his speech, his Devar Torah. Today he said. I am becoming a man. And he had. You could see it afterward when he recited the blessings over the challah and over the wine, and everyone shouted, L'chaim, to life. Danny had become a man. You could see him take up his place, and he was smiling and crying too. After the service, my parents and Heather decided not to stay for the party already starting in the reception hall. When they asked if I wanted a ride, I told them I would walk home instead. But I went to the parking lot with them anyway. As he unlocked the car, my father said, I bet you're glad you don't have to go through something like that. I guess I am, I said. What do you mean, I guess I am? He asked. Would you want to stand up there with all that stuff all over you and chant at everyone? It was a whole lot more than chanting at everyone, I replied. Let's get in the car, said my mother. No, said my father. He put his arms on top of the station wagon's roof. I'd like to know what Holling thought was a whole lot more. My stomach got tight. He became a man, I said. You think that's how you become a man? By chanting a few prayers? You think you become a man by getting a job as an architect? I said back. My father straightened. That's exactly how you become a man, he said. You get a good job and you provide for your family. You hang on and you play for keeps. That's how it works. I really do think we should just get in the car, said my mother. I don't think so, I said to my father. It's not just about a job. It's more. It has to do with choosing yourself. And you didn't even have to go to California to figure all of that out, said my father. So who are you, Holling? I felt Heather staring at me, and somehow, I don't know how, I thought of Bobby Kennedy, who could have made all the difference. I don't know yet, I said finally, but I'll let you know when I do. What a barrel of mumbo jumbo, said my father. He got into the station wagon and slammed the door. My mother blew me a kiss, really, and then got in too. And my sister got in last of all. She was smiling. I could hardly breathe. When they drove away, I went back inside Temple Bethel, where the sounds of the miracle were still loud. Danny was still smiling, and it wasn't just because Mr. Goldman had brought huge trays of brown, light, perfect cream puffs. He couldn't stop smiling. And after a while, I couldn't either, especially once the dancing started and Merrill Lee took my hand. And even more, especially after Merrill Lee said, You look different. And I said, Maybe it's the yarmulke. And she said, No, it's something else. Merrill Lee, can the world buy such a jewel? It was when I had gone to find her a Coke that I saw Mrs. Baker standing alone beside a pile of sugared strawberries. She was holding one in her hand, smiling too. Now, I know you're not supposed to talk to your teacher outside of school activities. It's a rule that probably no one has ever broken. But I decided to break it anyway. Do you think that Lieutenant Baker will really be home in time for strawberries? I asked. Mrs. Baker, smiling, Mrs. Baker, did not look away from her strawberry. I'm sure of it, she said. Now I smiled. Do teachers always know the future? I asked. Always, she said. Shall I tell you yours? Standing there in the music of the bar mitzvah party, feeling the weight of what had happened in the synagogue, I saw again the glittering stream with its light rushing toward me. Don't tell me, I said. But how do you know? She looked away from the strawberry and at me. Do you remember Don Pedro standing alone at the end of the play? I nodded. Claudio has Hero, and they'll be fine. Benedict has Beatrice, and they'll be fine. Everyone else has everyone else, and they'll all be fine. The only one who's left alone is Don Pedro, and they all go off to dance and leave him behind. And they don't even remember that he's the one who has to deal with a traitor tomorrow, or that he hasn't got anyone at all. That's right, said Mrs. Baker, and maybe his whole country will split into pieces. He doesn't have any idea what's going to happen to him. Great comedy, I said. A comedy isn't about being funny, said Mrs. Baker. We've talked about this before, I said. A comedy is about characters who dare to know that they may choose a happy ending after all. That's how I know. So you can't see it? That's the daring part, said Mrs. Baker. So you think that Don Pedro ended up all right, I said. I think he became a man who brought peace and wisdom to his world because he knew about war and folly. I think he was loved greatly because he had seen what lost love is. And I think he came to know, too, that he was loved greatly. She looked at the strawberry in her hands. But I thought you didn't want to tell me your future, she said. The music started again, a quick ring dance. Danny Hupfer was going to dance with Mrs. Baguio, and my fee was doubled over with laughter. Mrs. Sidman had stepped into the ring beside Doug Switek, who didn't look all that happy. The Kowalskis and the Hupfers had come in together, Mrs. Hupfer and Mrs. Kowalski giggling in their stocking feet, since you can't dance in high heels, and Merrill Lee. Everyone was laughing and jostling to their places. I needed to go find mine. L'chaim, I said to Mrs. Baker, and she smiled. Not a teacher smile either. Chrysanthemum, she said back. 11 days later, on Wednesday, Lieutenant Tybalt Baker came home. It was the day that President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that the Marines were abandoning Kazan. I was at the airport. Me and Danny and my fee and Merrill Lee and Doug and the whole class, standing on the tarmac when the plane landed. We all held boxes of sweet strawberries. I guess you want to know what Mrs. Baker did when Lieutenant Baker came out of the plane. And I guess you'll probably want to know what Lieutenant Baker did when he saw Mrs. Baker on the tarmac. But toads, beetles, bats, if you can't figure that out for yourself, then a southwest blow on ye and blister you all over. Because let me tell you, it was a happy ending. The end. All right, fifth graders, that was the end of Wednesday Wars by Gary D. Schmidt. We finished it. We did it. So now what I want you to do on Friday, we will have a reading survey for you to take about the silent reading you've been doing at home, I'm sure of. And I'm going to have a question on there for you to reflect on the Wednesday Wars. So you're going to answer that question on Friday. So that means come Friday, when you have to take the reading survey, if you haven't watched our read alouds, you're going to be in some tough luck. So make sure you're caught up on our read alouds, and I can't wait to have a vote on our next read aloud, because you can bet we're going to keep doing read alouds even though we're not sitting in a classroom every single day anymore. Miss you guys. Keep working hard. I'm so proud of you.